part of the difficulty, I think, with trying to in particularly places like Exodus 21 to try to delineate, okay, this is talking about a debt slave and this is talking about a chattel slave. So I think for the most part, it's talking about debt slaves, but the language isn't precise in that sense, right? So you can't just use the Hebrew word eved to determine whether it's a chattel slave or a debt slave. It's all contextually based. So, what most scholars would say about how to define slavery in the ancient world is they would mostly make the distinction between debt slaves and chattel slaves. So, debt slaves are just any slave that their slavery is contingent upon the repayment of a debt and is theoretically not a permanent situation. And then chattel slavery is one that is not contingent upon a debt. So it's really that, I think it's really that simple. So the big passages like Exodus 21, 20 to 21, probably talking about debt slaves. I think we have pretty good parallels in other ancient Near Eastern texts that talk about similar situations. So I like, there are people like Gregory Kirikigno in his 93 volume, I think in the JSOT series, like he lays out all the different people that have different opinions on whether that's chattel slavery or debt slavery. But I think it's probably debt slavery. Definitely when you get into Deuteronomy 15, you're definitely talking about Israelite debt slaves there. Certainly you're talking about Israelite debt slaves in Exodus 21 verses 2 to 6 and then 7 through 11.
So, and not just the location of the debt slave versus the chattel slavery, but what would be the difference about how the two might be treated?
Yeah, so debt slaves, generally speaking, are treated a little bit better, and the rationale, and that's not just in the Hebrew Bible, just generally in the ancient Near East, they're not considered strict property. And so, if you look at the laws of Hammurabi, for example, you have a distrainee, someone who's taken as a distraint in order to, motivate somebody to pay off a debt or to have them serve until they pay off their debt. Those people are not considered permanent possessions, right? The master owns the work, not so much the individual. So that they tend to get treated a little bit better. So you have the places that you can tell where it's clearly Israelite debt slaves is where it says it, right? So Exodus 21, 2 to 6, it talks about an Eved Ivri, so the Hebrew slave. Deuteronomy 15, very explicit, Hebrew slave. And then, of course, in Leviticus 25, you can't have them as slaves anymore, the Israelites as slaves. And that's where you really get precise chattel slavery explained. So verses 44 to 46, and I'll stop talking because I know you said keep it short, but yeah, that's where it's talking about foreign slaves and they're not contingent upon a debt. So
okay, so Fuz, I was going to ask you to jump in there.
And I appreciate the point that you're making. Hey, let's clarify what we mean when we use the terms. And I very much respect and appreciate Josh showing up on our show, and very much respect his work and his scholarship. And to me, I think when you look at the word that's used in the original Hebrew, that's referring to both Hebrew and non-Hebrew, Eved, or slaves, although I don't particularly like that word slave, but it's really Eved in both instances, or in all the instances that I've seen. And, there is actually, there are biblical scholars who argue that it's not slavery, it's not chattel slavery that's being described for both Hebrew and non-Hebrew, quote unquote slaves, but it's actually bond servanthood or bond service. And so, like in the King James, it's always translated as bond servant as opposed to slave. And and again, I'm a biochemist. I'm not a biblical scholar, but I am a student of the Bible, and I've read extensively as much as I could on this. And sadly, there's not a lot about slavery in the Old Testament that's really available, or at least available for broad consumption. So I very much appreciate the fact that Josh has put together a really good book on this issue. But for example, Isaac Allen, who was an interesting writer, biblical scholar, writing around the time of the Civil War, making the case that there is no such thing as chattel slavery being taught in the Bible, which was really significant for that time. Here's a book that I have from a Hebrew scholar. This was published in 1898, Moses Milesiner, who actually argues again that there's no chattel slavery being taught in the Old Testament. And so I think you could make a case that it's actually not chattel slavery, but it's really bond service. And really what distinguishes between the Hebrew and the non-Hebrew is, for the Hebrew, that bond servants actually ends at 7 years, whereas for the foreigner or the non-Hebrew, it could extend essentially for that individual's lifetime.
Was that the conclusion of your thought there, Fuz?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I want to go ahead and jump in, and Joe, if you could, first of all, you have a absolutely great Hebrew shirt there.
Thank you. Made it myself.
You're welcome. And just wanted to have you introduce yourself a little bit and like your expertise in this area, and what you bring into the table, and weigh in your thoughts on this, because I think this is pretty significant right out of the gate. If there really is no delineation between the types of slavery, if you agree with that, disagree with that, and again, what is your background and how it qualifies you to speak on this?
Yeah, so my real quick background, the thumbnail sketches, 20 some years in a lot of pastoral ministry. Went through multiple degrees and master's degrees in different things, from philosophy of science to theology. Have a DMin and mostly ministry, leadership kind of things. But I'm doing my PhD right now in ethics. And so kind of focus on that ethics side. And a lot of my research really is into this idea of B'Tselem Elohim, which is the shirt, this idea of we're all made in the image of God and human sacredness. So I get into these studies of, the question, why didn't God condemn slavery? And as an ethicist guy, and as a guy who's looking at a lot of Old Testament passages and studying these things, especially in light of racial issues in the United States, which has been a lot of my focus. These are pretty critical issues because of how a lot of these old passages were used to justify slavery. And so I would say that one important distinction that's worth noting, and this comes from Peter Williams, great scholar. He does some work with Cambridge. He's an ESV translation guy. So he has a great talk on some of this stuff. But he notes that like in the later 20th century, so in the late 1900s, you had this plethora of English translations, but not just English. Actually, he looked at like a dozen translations in these Western languages like Spanish, Dutch, German, all these. And they started to translate Eved as with the word slave or slavery. And that wasn't used prior to those times in older translations. And so I think, and this is my take on it, this short take on this is, I think what you have, based on a lot of other studies that I've done in this area, you had a lot of people, whether intentionally or unintentionally, looking through these ancient, systems of service and reinterpreting it through the lens of a modern worldview of slavery. Some may be to justify it, some may be to condemn it. They might have different motives of why, but I think they start to do that in the modern translations, and we lose that nuance. And I think that's what Dr. Josh was talking about, that nuance of the word Eved and what it brings. Because, in some cases, we have texts that talk about, being the Eved of God, where it's a blessing. You're blessed to be God's Eved, his bond slave or bond servant, however you want to translate that. And so we have, in ancient Near East, with hospitality being so important, when somebody came and a stranger to your home, the homeowner became the Eved of the stranger. They became the servant of the slaver. So it really depicts this relationship of service that can have very negative meanings and very positive meanings. It just depends on the context. And so I think that's something to just note and be careful of. So, and I think that's why the Bible doesn't condemn slavery in the way we would like it. because to condemn slavery was really impossible because the word had a lot of meanings that some were good and some were bad. But in our meaning, it's always bad. And so I think that's where the miscue comes. Hopefully that makes some sense.